Well, we move back to Israel now, and news that perhaps Hezbollah will be joining in the terrible conflict that's happening in Israel right now. Well, joining us to discuss this and other developing issues in the Levant is tonight's guest, Gary Tabach. He's a former chief of staff of NATO's military liaison mission in Moscow. Sir, thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Conrad. Hello, TVP.
All right. Well, let's start right away with Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah. He's the Secretary General of Hezbollah, and he made a recent speech, a very troubling speech. Could you tell us quickly who is this guy, and what's he trying to say?
He's a replacement of Yasser Arafat. He's been trained in Russia as a terrorist, just like the rest of them were, and it is not a secret that on the West Bank, as the Hezbollah protesting against Israel, they're holding pictures and portraits of Putin. So this is another terrorist organization, just like Hezbollah, except ones are Shias, the other ones are Sunnis, and they're supposed to be like against each other. But what unites them is the hate for Israel.
You mentioned Russia. These guys are being traded in Russia. A lot of people, I think, assume that they're more connected with Iran than they are with Russia. How much is Iran intertwined with this, and how much Russia?
They're both intertwined. They're both involved in it. But Russia, it was originally, when it was Soviet Union, it was Russia. They were training in their camps what terrorism is and how to apply it and how to use it against Israel in the sense. So it continues to be that way. That is why we see that they're visiting Russia quite often, their representations, and Russia is in support of them. So, and as well as Iran, it's an axis of evil. So they're working hand to hand. Again, just to remind you, I was a commander of the NATO's anti-terrorism center in Turkey. So I do know a little bit about the way terrorism and the way Russia is involved with every terrorist group there is known to us in any way.
That's right. Another question. I mean, this group obviously is operating in Lebanon. What is the Lebanese government doing to control that situation?
Lebanese government cannot do anything to control the situation because Hezbollah has taken over beautiful Lebanon, where Christian and Muslims lived together for years in peace and prosperity. It was a Riviera of the Middle East. Now, unfortunately, it is ruined. Again, to remind you, that Hezbollah ended up there when the Jordanian king kicked out PLO and Yasser Arafat out for conducting terrorist activity in Jordan, and this is why they don't want him back. And they ended up in Lebanon, and Lebanon after that ended up in the bloodiest war ever, against which there were no protests on the streets in the West for some reason, even though thousands and thousands of Christians and Muslims were killed in that war.
Well, speaking of which, Blinken is now on his way to Jordan. What might he be wishing to do out there?
It is very difficult to predict our administrations in the United States because one day they're saying one thing, the other day they're saying another thing. I assume, and again, I hate to assume, that all Palestinians, whether they're in the West Bank or in Gaza, they are Jordanian citizens. But unfortunately, Jordan doesn't want to allow them back in, and neither is Egypt.
Egypt doesn't want them. Jordan doesn't want them. Where can they possibly go?
It becomes.
I mean, what about Qatar? Qatar has found itself in a very, cozy position here as a mediator between the two sides, but at the same time, from what I know, they're one of the major financial backers of Hamas. Shouldn't they take a little bit of responsibility here? What do you think?
And they're the ones that are transferring $6 billion that were released, that were frozen for 40 years to Iran that has been released by Biden administration. So, again, this problem should be an Arab problem, a Muslim problem. Palestinian people in that situation for almost 80 years, they're still in a refugee status. Look, I'm a refugee too. I came from refugees. And we all get absorbed by the countries we're in. So Israel absorbed, I don't know how many, 5 million people in that time from all over the world. But somehow it is Israeli problem where the world and where Mr. Blinken should do is pressure the Arab world to resolve the problem with the unfortunate Palestinian people who are taken hostage for so many years by the terror organization, but somehow it becomes an Israeli problem. And in all honesty, I really don't understand that. When the Houthis and Tutsis were killed, macheted down by 1 million people, there were no protests on the streets. When Russians are now, right now, created 20 million people refugees in Ukraine and killing Ukrainian children, bombarding them in Ukraine. There are no protests on the streets all over the world. Okay, maybe they're not Muslims, but we can say that that Kurdish people, 40 million Kurdish people by Erdogan administration are being abused and starved, but they're Muslims. But
that's another topic all on its own, and I hope we have a chance to get into that at some point. Yeah,
I want to just
Mr. Erdogan is always innocent.
Well, then the Chinese, the Uyghurs, they're in the concentration camps, but being starved and abused. They're Muslims, but there are no protests on the streets. Why is it then with Israel, a modern country, that that contributes so much to
very
to
important
the
question.
Now
very important question, and this question must be asked more often, sir. Thanks very much for taking the time. A pleasure speaking with you, sir.
Sure.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye bye.
And thank you for joining us this evening. But please stay with us here on TVP World. World Today is coming up next.